Hey guys, tonight we're plunging into a topic so scandalous. Queen Victoria herself would faint, recover, then faint again for dramatic effect, the most terrifying sexual practices of Victorian England's royals. If you thought Bridgerton was steamy, just wait until you hear about the things that kept Buckingham Palace up at night. And not because someone left the gas lights on. So before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that white noise, and get as comfortable as possible. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a royal in the Victorian era? Did Prince Albert really invent his famous piercing for comfort? Or was it just the world's most elaborate party trick? Why did Queen Victoria have 9 kids? Was it love, duty, or just a lack of television? Was royal underwear as weird as those family trees? Did anyone actually know what they were doing under all those petticoats? And how did Victorian medical science, with its potions, gadgets, and wildly optimistic applications of leeches, handle anything remotely related to sex? Would you last a day in a palace where an intimate evening might involve 4 layers of undergarments, a visiting priest, and a detailed journal entry for posterity? Or would you run screaming after discovering what passed for contraception or worse, Aphrodisiacs? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1860. You're in a room full of velvet curtains, monogrammed chamber pots, and relatives so closely related they technically count as their own football team. The air is thick with secrets, lavender perfume, and the gentle whir of scandal. Good luck. Let's talk about bedtime. Not your bedtime, where you might slip into a t-shirt, throw a sock at the cat, and scroll your phone until the blue light sears your corneas. No, this is the Victorian royal bedroom. A place where preparing for intimacy involved more fabric than a modern bridal shop, and more anxiety than a middle school dance. Your night begins with the royal undressing. Forget any notion of slipping seductively out of your clothes. This is less a striptease, and more a slow-motion game of historical Jenga. Each layer must be removed in the correct order. Petticoats, corsets, chemises, drawers, stockings, garters, dressing gowns, bed jackets, and if you're truly unlucky, a decorative shawl someone's grandmother insisted you wear for luck. You are undressing in front of a dressing maid, a lady-in-waiting, a chamberlain, and possibly a footman pretending to fix the curtains but actually keeping score. By the time you've reached bare skin, you've burned enough calories to justify a midnight pie. But now you're cold, mildly dizzy, and starting to wonder if all this trouble is worth producing an heir. For the royal man, it's not much better. Victorian men wore nightshirts, sometimes topped with a nightcap. And occasionally, for reasons lost to history, slippers, just in case they needed to make a dignified midnight escape. But don't picture the rakish Prince Charming of fairy tales. Instead, imagine someone's uncle at a pajama party, fussing with buttons while pretending he knows what's about to happen. The bed itself is a feat of architecture. These are not beds, they are fluffy fortresses, with so many sheets, coverlets, counterpanes, bolsters, and pillows that it takes 5 minutes just to find a patch of mattress. You must part the curtains, yes, the actual curtains, because Victorian beds came with privacy drapes, ideal for keeping out both drafts and judgmental ancestors haunting the halls. Lighting is a challenge. You have candles, which flicker like they're about to reveal a ghost, and gas lamps, which hiss menacingly and sometimes explode, adding a fun sense of urgency to the evening. You do not, under any circumstances, want to catch your nightgown on fire. Not only will this spoil the mood, but you will also end up as a cautionary tale for the next 4 generations. Privacy? A myth. Walls are thin, corridors echo, and at least 3 servants are lurking outside with urgent questions about towels. Your ancestors are staring down at you from stern oil paintings, their expressions caught somewhere between judgment and constipation. Now, let's imagine you finally reach the moment of intimacy. If you think modern dating is stressful, Try initiating romance while wearing a starched nightgown beneath 6 wool blankets, with one arm stuck in a sleeve, and the Queen's favourite corgi glaring from the foot of the bed. Foreplay is less passion and more negotiation, and any sudden movement risks a wardrobe malfunction, a head injury, or a new royal scandal. For the Victorians, sex was supposed to be a dignified, barely acknowledged event. The aim was to produce heirs quietly and return to pretending you didn't have a body the rest of the week. The etiquette manuals were clear. Dim the lights, say your prayers, and try not to make too much noise. If anyone giggled, it was grounds for an annulment, or at the very least, an awkward breakfast. In the end, the royal bedroom wasn't a place of forbidden pleasure. It was a labyrinth of cloth, etiquette, servants, and the crushing weight of expectations. But if you somehow managed to survive the night without being discovered, judged, or accidentally setting yourself on fire, you could consider it a victory. Sleep tight. Just don't let the chambermaid catch you snoring. In the Victorian palace, even your dreams are supposed to be dignified. Let's set the scene. You are Queen Victoria, monarch of an empire so sprawling that the sun never sets on it, though, based on your diary entries, it also never really rises in the royal bedroom. For over a century, historians have painted Victoria as the world's prissiest grandmother. The kind of person who'd faint at a limerick and ban Christmas if it got too flirty. But the real story? Well, it's a little more complicated. Victorian England's whole sexual morality circus began with you. Every etiquette book, every dusty sermon, every nervous parent blaming modern society on loose corset strings. It all circles back to the Queen who declared, "We are not amused." But here's the secret Your Highness never wanted published. You were, in fact, occasionally very amused, especially when Prince Albert was in the room. Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert is often depicted as a noble partnership. More business merger than romance. And yes, there was duty, there were state dinners, and there was the small matter of running a continent or two. But there was also a truly astonishing number of royal children, 9 to be precise. That is not the family size of someone who thinks hand-holding is too racy. Behind the palace walls, Victoria's private letters tell a very different story from her public persona. She wrote to Albert daily, sometimes twice, with the kind of longing that makes a modern group chat blush. In one letter, she confesses to missing his dear, dear kisses and refers to him as her angel. Not exactly the sort of thing you expect from the face of public repression. Of course, Queen Victoria did her absolute best to keep her subjects pure, as long as nobody asked too many questions about what was going on behind the scenes. Publicly, she led the charge for moral rectitude, lacing up the empire in piety, starched collars, and sexual anxiety. But privately, well, Victoria believed marital passion was a God-given joy, and she had no trouble availing herself of it, so long as it was, for queenly purposes, or possibly a Tuesday. Still, nothing sums up Victorian sexual confusion like the Queen's attitude toward her own children. After Prince Albert died, Victoria went into mourning for 4 decades, swaddling herself in black and forbidding her daughters from even thinking about romance without 3 layers of chaperones and a signed affidavit from the Archbishop of Canterbury. The irony, of course, was lost on no one. After all, their mother had been known to drag Albert off to bed in the middle of official events, once telling her diary, "My dearest Albert put on my stockings for me a great comfort. It's always the quiet ones. As for her sons?" Let's just say the apple did not fall far from the tree, except it rolled downhill, bounced through a few saloons, and ended up at the bottom of a pile of scandal. Prince Edward, later Edward VII, was famous for testing the limits of his mother's patience and Victorian plumbing. He was the original royal party boy, the prototype for every future headline about scandalous heirs. His exploits gave the entire British tabloid industry its start. So was Queen Victoria really as chaste and cold as legend claims? Not even close. She was, in the end, just another Victorian, deeply conflicted, hopelessly romantic, occasionally passionate, and desperately afraid someone might find out. If you ever wonder why the British are so famously reserved, remember, their role model was a woman who preached abstinence, practiced something else entirely, and managed to turn her bedroom into the most productive factory in the empire. As you drift off tonight, spare a thought for Victoria, the original queen of mixed messages. Let's move from scandalous diaries to perhaps the most infamous rumor in royal history, Prince Albert's piercing. If you've never heard of it, congratulations, your browser history is safe for another day. But for the rest of us, let's tiptoe into the shadowy, slightly metallic legend of Victorian England's most private bling. It all begins with Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Queen Victoria's consort and the father of her rapidly expanding royal brood. Albert was, by all accounts, a serious man. He loved science, education, and making sure the curtains were drawn before anyone caught a glimpse of his ankles. He also, according to one particularly tenacious rumor, enjoyed wearing a ring in a location best left to the imagination and medical professionals. The story goes that Albert, ever a victim of those tight, fashionable trousers of the day, found himself, well, uncomfortably arranged in the region that most men would prefer not to have rearranged at all. The solution? A piercing, strategically placed, supposedly to help him dress to the left and achieve a smoother silhouette beneath the close-fitting trousers favored by the upper crust. This, the legend claims, was not only practical but downright chic, proving that in the Victorian era, fashion really was pain. And sometimes, so was love. Let's pause here for a reality check. The so-called Prince Albert piercing doesn't appear in any royal medical records, diaries or letters, not even in the Queen's more poetic moments. No sketches. No, dear diary. Today, Albert tried something new with a jeweler from Piccadilly. Most historians chalk this up to the wild imaginations of later generations, or perhaps a few enterprising jewelers eager to spice up the world of men's accessories. But just because something isn't true doesn't mean it can't haunt history. The Prince Albert rumor took off in the late 20th century, surfacing in tattoo parlors and adult magazines with alarming regularity. Suddenly, a very private part of history had become the punchline at parties and the subject of awkward pub quizzes. In a way, it's the perfect Victorian story, elaborate, just believable enough, and absolutely mortifying to explain at family gatherings. The Victorians, for their part, would have been horrified if, that is, they ever took a break from inventing new ways to say no to fun. The idea that the very model of royal masculinity had a secret, scandalous bit of jewelry lurking beneath his tailored trousers, it was enough to send half the empire swooning and the other half furiously embroidering modesty panels. Of course, if you were to ask a modern piercing enthusiast about the Prince Albert, you'd likely get an enthusiastic, if slightly graphic, tutorial about anatomical real estate, healing times, and the importance of proper aftercare. In Victorian times, however, the only aftercare you got was a disapproving stare from your butler and the lingering shame of knowing you could never again ride a horse in comfort. What does all this mean for you, drifting off to sleep? Well, it's a gentle reminder that every age has its taboos, its urban legends, and its whispered stories that refuse to die, no matter how many historians beg them to. The Prince Albert piercing probably never existed, but the myth lives on, proving that when it comes to royal history, the truth is always just one rumor away from a Victorian fainting couch. So, if you ever find yourself worrying about fashion trends or questionable jewelry choices, remember, you are at least in excellent and possibly imaginary company. In Victorian England, dinner conversation was an art form, and by art, we mean a complicated exercise in never mentioning anything real. You're seated at a table longer than most apartments, flanked by 4 forks, a candelabrum threatening to set your sleeve on fire, and at least 2 distant cousins who are both your relatives, if the family tree is to be believed. each other's great uncle, the one subject no one can escape? The royal duty to produce heirs. For the royal family, making babies wasn't just a personal project. It was a matter of national security, an economic plan, and a topic so sensitive it could only be discussed in code, whispers, and interpretive coughing. Duty meant exactly one thing: get married, get busy, and do it enough times that the monarchy survived the next round of scandals, illnesses, or surprise duels. From the moment you're old enough to sit up straight at the table, your life is planned out in a series of genealogical charts and polite threats. Your job is to marry well, produce heirs, and absolutely never let your parents catch you reading a French novel. Marriage wasn't about romance, it was a geopolitical chess match. The stakes? Everything from trade agreements to who got to ride the biggest horse in the next military parade. And yet, despite all the protocol and planning, nothing could prepare anyone for the royal process of actually having children. The pressure was immense, palace doctors hovering, a line of hopeful courtiers outside the bedchamber, and, in case you needed a little extra stress, Queen Victoria herself keeping count of grandchildren with the intensity of an Olympic judge. If there was ever an Olympic event for staring at your daughter-in-law until she produced a male heir, the Victorians would have taken gold, but the stress didn't stop at conception. No, producing an heir was a team sport, complete with midwives, chaplains, politicians, and the odd visiting ambassador, all eager for news of a safe delivery. When the royal baby finally arrived, the event was announced with everything short of fireworks, gun salutes, ringing bells, official proclamations, and, in one memorable case, a 21-gun salute that accidentally set the neighbor's garden shed ablaze. Of course, royal children weren't just children, they were living, breathing insurance policies. If you produced a healthy male heir, congratulations. You were invited to sit at the good end of the dinner table and received an extra slice of pudding. If you produced a girl, you were still celebrated, but with a slightly shorter speech and the unspoken expectation that you try again before dessert. Family dinners were a minefield. On the surface, everything was civil, a toast to the Queen, polite laughter, the delicate clink of silver on porcelain. Underneath, it was a battleground of passive-aggressive compliments, sideways glances, and coded questions about expanding the family. No one said the word sex, heavens no. But if you read between the lines, every conversation circled back to when, exactly, the next baby might be arriving. Such lovely weather for walks in the garden, don't you think? Perfect for family activities. And let's not forget the endless parade of distant relatives, each with their own expectations, inheritance claims, and unsolicited advice on how to guarantee a son. If you survived dinner without choking on your pudding or blurting out something unfortunate, you deserved a medal, or at least a private moment to scream into a velvet pillow. So, as you settle in for sleep, remember, every royal heir you read about in history books was the product of 1,000 awkward dinners, 1,000,000 whispered reminders, and an empire's worth of pressure to keep the family name and the drama alive for one more generation. So you've survived the dinner table, sidestepped the Queen's questions about heirs, and managed not to set yourself on fire with the candelabra. Congratulations. Now, let's tiptoe into one of the royal palace's worst-kept secrets: affairs, discreet liaisons, and the kind of bed-hopping that would make a French playwright blush. The public face of the Victorian royals was all starch, duty, and endless portraits of people who looked like they were holding in a sneeze. But behind the bedroom doors, if you could ever find your way through the labyrinth of curtains, servants, and social expectations, was a whole different world. For all their rules and moral panic, the Victorians were masters of the do, as I say, not as I do philosophy. Especially when it came to their own private lives. Royal affairs weren't a modern invention. They were as old as royalty itself, possibly older if you count the Greek gods and their soap opera. But in the Victorian palace, discretion wasn't just a virtue. It was a survival strategy. Everyone had secrets, and everyone's job was to pretend not to notice them. If you were in the know, you kept quiet, kept your job, and kept your mouth firmly shut, lest you end up as the subject of the next family painting, posed out of focus at the back. For kings and princes, the unofficial motto was, "If you can't be good, be careful." That meant secret staircases, hidden doors, coded letters, and midnight meetings in drawing rooms where the only witnesses were long-suffering potted plants. Some staff specialized in looking the other way. The best chamberlain was the one who could hear the sound of royal footsteps at 2 a.m. and somehow find a reason to go polish doorknobs in another wing. Royal women weren't immune to temptation either, though their risks were exponentially higher. If a prince got caught, it was called a youthful indiscretion and solved with a well-timed holiday in France. If a princess got caught, it was a scandal, complete with threats of exile, fainting fits, and emergency consultations with a bishop. Still, rumors swirled. There were stories of governesses who left the palace with a glowing reference and a suspiciously plump baby, or footmen who rose mysteriously through the ranks after helping the crown princess organize her correspondence. And then there were the royal affairs that went spectacularly, hilariously wrong. There's the tale of the nobleman discovered halfway up a chimney when the king returned early from hunting, or the maid who accidentally mixed up 2 sets of love letters and launched a decade-long diplomatic crisis. Sometimes, a palace tryst ended with nothing more dramatic than someone's wig falling off at the wrong moment. Other times, it triggered a war, or at least a very stern memo from the Prime Minister. For all the drama, the real skill was in the cover-up. Royal fixers worked overtime, distracting the press, bribing witnesses, and when all else failed, blaming everything on continental influences. Diaries were edited, letters burned, and portraits retouched. Occasionally, entire family branches were quietly erased from the history books, all because someone couldn't resist a midnight stroll in the moonlight. Yet somehow, the monarchy survived. The affairs became stories, the disasters became legends, and the palace staff perfected the art of professional denial. As you drift off tonight, remember, the greatest legacy of the Victorian royals isn't just their castles or their crowns, but their unshakable belief that with enough velvet curtains and awkward silences, anything can be swept under the rug, at least until breakfast. Let's take a peek, purely for historical research, of course, at the written word in the royal household. If you think your old texts are embarrassing, imagine living in a world where every diary, letter, and steamy love note had a non-zero chance of ending up in the National Archives, dissected by scholars, and, if you're really unlucky, read aloud at a parliamentary hearing. Victorian royals wrote everything down. They had to, between the lack of Netflix, the abundance of free time, and a national obsession with journaling, almost every feeling, headache, and fleeting romance was captured on paper. Queen Victoria herself was a prolific diarist. She wrote more than 60 million words over her lifetime, enough to fill a small library, or at least a few months' worth of internet arguments. But here's the catch. Privacy was a luxury even the Queen could barely afford. Every letter you wrote, every diary entry you scribbled, was at risk of being intercepted by servants, nosy relatives, or that one suspiciously literate corgi. And if you were a royal, you could count on at least 3 people reading your mail before you ever got it back. Even your private correspondence was copied, catalogued, and, for the especially unlucky, published in the Times with all the juicy bits redacted. Censorship was everywhere. Victorian society thrived on secrets, but it thrived even more on making sure no one else found out about them. Palace officials developed entire departments dedicated to editing royal papers. If Queen Victoria's diaries wandered too close to scandal, someone would quietly trim the offending lines, leaving future historians to puzzle over cryptic entries like, "Today I saw Albert's, illegible, how very robust." For the younger royals, Diaries were both confessionals and traps. Teenage princesses poured their hearts out about crushes, heartbreaks, and ill-advised poetry, only to have their journals seized for safekeeping. Princes penned love letters to actresses and opera singers, then spent years pretending they'd never learned to write at all. There were, of course, the professional snoops. The master of the Queen's household had the authority to open mail, confiscate suspect packages, and investigate unusual correspondence. The Home Secretary kept a nervous eye on royal diaries, worried that a stray sentence could trigger a scandal or, at the very least, inspire 1,000 gossip columns. Even family members got in on the act. Queen Victoria famously edited her own children's letters, striking out anything that smacked of improper sentiment or, heaven forbid, slang. The Queen's eldest daughter, Vicky, learned to write entire letters in code just to keep her mother from finding out about her latest crush on a German prince. And then there's the great Victorian paper purge. Upon her death, Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, spent decades editing her mother's journals, cutting entire volumes and rewriting the rest with all the enthusiasm of someone trying to erase every bad decision from a group chat. The result? Historians are still arguing over what Victoria really thought about, well, anything. But for all the redacting, editing, and gentle shredding, the written word survived. Letters slipped through the cracks. Diaries were hidden in attic trunks. And sometimes, the most scandalous entries were the ones nobody bothered to censor at all. So as you drift off tonight, comfort yourself with this thought. No matter how embarrassing your DMs, at least you don't have a small army of butlers, bishops, and future historians critiquing your love life, correcting your spelling, and blacking out your best lines. Some secrets, thankfully, stay in the drafts folder forever. Let's take a deep, cautious breath and step into the royal sick room, a place where modern medicine goes to weep, and even the bravest Victorian hesitated before sitting on the examination table. For the royals, sex, health, and scandal were all tangled up with medicine, and the cures were sometimes more terrifying than the symptoms. First, let's set the scene. The Victorian royal physician didn't just hand out cough syrup and call it a day. No, they wielded a terrifying arsenal of devices, ointments, and the kind of medical advice that could only be described as bold. Diagnoses ranged from nervous excitement to invisible vapors, and treatments were more experimental than a midlife crisis at Burning Man. The Victorians had a gadget for everything. Concerned you were too passionate? Try an ice-water douche. Feeling enervated? There's a machine that promises to vibrate the bad feelings out of you. Just don't ask where the electrodes go. Prince Albert reportedly suffered from chronic male complaints, for which he was prescribed everything from leeching, bad, to mercury ointments, worse. And, on one occasion, a strict regimen of cold baths and motivational pamphlets. If a royal showed even the faintest sign of excess ardor, out came the medical instruments. Electric belts, clockwork vibrators, and things that looked like props from a low-budget sci-fi film. Some of these were so complicated that the doctor needed a manual, a footman, and nerves of steel just to operate them. No one ever talks about the time Queen Victoria was prescribed a vapor cabinet, basically a steampunk sauna in which the patient, shrouded in towels and boiling fog, sat perfectly still while servants prayed. Nothing exploded. Victorian physicians also had a weakness for potions. There were aphrodisiacs, elixirs of herbs, exotic roots, and the occasional illegal import from France. Then there were tonics to calm the nerves, laudanum, an opiate, patent medicines, and, for the truly brave, raw alcohol disguised as restorative cordial. Side effects included dizziness, euphoria, and waking up married to a minor aristocrat. Of course, some treatments were pure quackery. Magnetic hats promised to redirect your energies. Mustard plasters were slapped onto bare skin to draw out the humours. And leeches, always leeches, were on hand to drain you of blood, willpower, and the desire to ever look at a pond again. Privacy was non-existent. Ailing royals could expect a daily parade of doctors, chaplains, and curious relatives popping in just to check on the patient's color. There were no HIPAA laws, only a collective agreement to pretend that nothing embarrassing had happened, even when the king's vitality was being tested by a device with more gears than a watchmaker's shop. In the end, Victorian royal medicine was equal parts science, superstition, and pure hope. Some cures worked. Most didn't. But every strange device, secret tonic, and mysterious prescription lives on in the footnotes of history and the nightmares of modern doctors everywhere. So if you wake up tonight with a sniffle, just be glad your remedy isn't apply leeches and recite the Lord's Prayer. Trust me, you're better off with NyQuil and a good Wi-Fi signal. Let's dim the lights and imagine the moment. You're tucked beneath 5 layers of brocade, nursing a mysterious rash you're hoping is just an allergic reaction to Cousin Alfred's cologne, when there's a knock at the bedroom door. It's not the footman with tea, nor the housemaid with the latest gossip. No. Tonight, it's the royal physician, armed with a leather bag, a monocle, and the world's most uncomfortable notebook. Being the royal doctor in Victorian England was not for the faint of heart. You were expected to treat everything from melancholia to overexcitement, all while tiptoeing around egos larger than the British Empire. If you cured the king's indigestion, you were invited to dinner. If you mentioned the queen's insomnia, you were invited to leave. Permanently. For the physician, no subject was too sensitive. They were called in to consult on fertility. Read, why aren't there more heirs yet? Mysterious aches. Read, another failed aphrodisiac. And even to referee those marital disagreements that started in the drawing room and ended with someone storming out in a nightgown. Sometimes you were expected to keep secrets. Sometimes you were expected to report those secrets directly to the Queen. The trick was knowing which was which. Examinations were rarely private. There could be 3 servants, a lady-in-waiting, and the Queen's third-best cousin all present, just to observe. If you thought your annual checkup was bad, imagine describing your symptoms while a bishop sits in the corner taking notes for posterity. When things got truly awkward, say, when the royal patient's vigor was in question, the physician might break out the most advanced tools of the age. Glass thermometers, stethoscopes, and gadgets best left to the imagination. No one knew quite what to expect, which is why the most common prescription was fresh air, a little brandy, and not mentioning this to anyone, ever. For more personal matters, royals were subjected to all manner of probing questions about marital harmony. The physician became part counselor, part confessor, and always on the lookout for signs of a scandal. After all, a well-timed cough or a misplaced love bite could send the entire palace into panic mode. And let's not forget the paperwork. Every diagnosis, every blush-inducing symptom, every desperate request for privacy, please was carefully recorded, copied, and locked in a file cabinet, right next to the cook's recipe for mutton pie. If you were lucky, your most embarrassing moments would never see daylight. If you were unlucky, they'd be referenced in a future parliamentary debate about the moral fitness of the monarchy. The life of a royal physician was a balancing act. Keep the royals alive, keep the secrets safe, and never, under any circumstances, let your medical bag out of sight unless you wanted to find the Queen's pet spaniel trying on your stethoscope. So next time you grumble about a doctor's waiting room, spare a thought for those brave souls who had to keep straight faces while treating ailments that no one wanted to name, let alone explain to the king's mother. It's hard to overstate just how much the Victorian era revolved around virtue. And by virtue, we mean a national campaign to make sure nobody, anywhere, was having too much fun. Especially not in the palace. Queen Victoria herself was the face of this movement. Stern, unsmiling, and always shrouded in enough black silk to signal that pleasure was, at best, a distant memory. Her standards were so strict that even table legs were covered to prevent unseemly thoughts. You couldn't make this up. A passing glance at an uncovered piano leg could, apparently, lead to moral ruin. This obsession didn't stop at furniture. The Queen's personal tastes, private, prudish, and ever so slightly anxious, became the law of the land. Ministers and bishops seized on the royal example, launching a nationwide morality crusade. Suddenly, the only acceptable forms of entertainment were church hymns, tepid tea, and novels so boring even their authors gave up halfway through. Sex outside marriage? Unthinkable. Even inside marriage, it was best done in total darkness. While thinking about the British Museum, laws were passed to regulate everything from literature to bathing costumes. If your swimsuit revealed more than 2 inches of ankle, you risked being exiled to Wales. Obscenity was so broadly defined that you could be fined for owning a suggestive bar of soap. For the royal family, maintaining virtue became a full-time job. Every action, every word, every slightly risque cough was scrutinized for evidence of moral decay. Queen Victoria's children learned early that the only acceptable form of romance was writing long, painfully formal letters, and even then, someone else might be reading them first. The Queen's approach to virtue trickled down the social ladder. Upper-class households installed modesty screens and hired chaperones for everything from afternoon tea to casual strolls in the garden. Middle-class parents gave their daughters etiquette books the size of bricks. Working-class families, meanwhile, were mostly just confused why anyone would bother hiding their table legs when they couldn't even afford a table. But here's the twist. Behind all the lectures, the Victorians still found ways to rebel. The more the Queen preached virtue, the more the nation became obsessed with vice. Brothels flourished, marital aids were sold by discreet catalogue, and the underground trade in naughty French postcards exploded. As for the palace, well, let's just say that a surprising amount of Victorian virtue was enforced with a wink, a nudge, and the world's largest carpet to sweep things under. Tonight, as you settle beneath your duvet, uncovered table legs and all, reflect on the epic struggle between desire and decorum. Remember, no matter how uptight things get, human nature always finds a way to sneak out for a midnight stroll. Usually when the Queen's not looking, it's time for the talk. No, not the awkward conversation your parents had with you at 13 after you'd already figured out everything from the internet. We're talking about royal sex education, Victorian style. Awkward, confusing, and usually about 3 years too late. In the palace, sex was the secret everyone knew about, but no one dared to explain. Most royal children learned about it the same way everyone else did, by accident, eavesdropping on the staff, or deciphering cryptic advice from a stammering aunt. The official curriculum? A pamphlet, some Latin phrases, and a stern warning to avoid French novels. If you were very lucky, your mother might have offered a few vague hints on your wedding day. If you were unlucky, your father gave you a speech about duty and handed you a prayer book. Either way, you were left with more questions than answers, and a vague sense that marital happiness depended on keeping the curtains closed and never, ever laughing at the wrong moment. Queen Victoria herself believed that innocence was a royal virtue, best preserved by absolute ignorance. She instructed her daughters that conjugal duties were to be endured with dignity, and that pleasure was, if not a sin, then certainly a minor inconvenience. Her sons were warned to keep their trousers buttoned and their diaries locked. To help the next generation along, the palace sometimes arranged for a medical expert to deliver a short, clinical lecture, usually so full of euphemisms and moral warnings that no one understood a word. If you had questions, you asked the butler, who'd learned everything he knew from the stables, and that was the end of your formal education. The result? An entire generation of royals who approached intimacy like a surprise math test, full of dread, confusion, and the hope that it would all be over quickly. Official advice focused less on biology and more on how to preserve modesty at all costs. There were detailed instructions on where to look, the ceiling, what to say, nothing, and how to avoid embarrassing accidents. Try not to breathe. If a princess had questions about relations, she might consult her governess, who'd spent most of her life in a convent and thought French kissing referred to a diplomatic protocol. Young princes, meanwhile, traded schoolboy rumors about mysterious devices and what really went on behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace. And so, Victorian sex education ensured that nobody really knew what they were doing, but everyone was equally nervous about doing it wrong. For all their etiquette, the royal family could have used a little less modesty and a little more honesty. Tonight, as you nod off, give silent thanks for Google, for honest conversations, and for never having to decode a pamphlet titled On the Natural Duties of Matrimony. Sleep easy. You're already better educated than half the palace. Let's take a moment to imagine the most Victorian solution to a very human problem. How do you fulfill your royal marital duties when the mere sight of a naked ankle can cause a national crisis? The answer, of course, is the modesty curtain, possibly the world's most effective mood killer, and a physical reminder that, in Victorian England, pleasure and privacy rarely met. Picture yourself in the royal bedchamber, somewhere between too many candles and not enough common sense. The bed itself is a carved masterpiece, built to withstand generations of heirs, but the real showstopper is the curtain, a literal piece of cloth hanging between you and your spouse during moments of intimacy. Its purpose? To preserve decency. Its effect? To make even the most determined newlywed consider the monastic life. The modesty curtain, also known as the chastity veil or, for the more optimistic, the romance reducer, was not unique to the royals, but they embraced it with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for new tax laws and commemorative teaspoons. Etiquette books of the era described it as a necessary defense against immodesty, warning couples that even the shadow of indiscretion could bring shame upon the family name. Some manuals included diagrams, just in case the concept of hanging a curtain between two bodies required visual support. For the palace staff, the curtain was both a mystery and a running joke. Maids complained about dusting it. Footmen debated whether it should be opened before or after the morning tea. The Master of Ceremonies once included it in the official list of state assets, just above the Queen's travel umbrella and below the royal mutton fork. No one was quite sure who invented it, but everyone agreed that it was, above all else, deeply, irredeemably British. Now, let's talk logistics. The modesty curtain wasn't a tiny little handkerchief. It was often a full-length drape, heavy enough to block a draft and sturdy enough to survive an overzealous tug. It was suspended from the ceiling, attached to the bedposts, or, if you really wanted to confuse your partner, strung up in the middle of the room like a misplaced theatrical set. Sometimes, a slit in the fabric allowed for necessary contact, turning intimacy into a sort of Victorian puppet show, with all the thrill of unwrapping a particularly disappointing Christmas present. And yet, for all its absurdity, the curtain served its purpose. It offered a sense of ritual and order in a world obsessed with appearances. For the Queen, it meant privacy, control, and the ability to say, "I did my duty," while never risking an awkward eye contact. For the King, it provided a plausible excuse for any romantic mishaps. "Sorry, dear, I think my foot's caught in the hem." Of course, the curtain was only the beginning. Some couples added screens, sound-muffling tapestries, or even hired musicians to play outside the bedroom door. Anything to drown out the terrifying possibility of an audible giggle, a stray sigh, or, heaven forbid, the sound of royal furniture squeaking. In one particularly memorable case, a prince reportedly insisted on having the curtain drawn during the birth of his first child, just to make sure that even the midwife couldn't catch a glimpse of impropriety. The result? Chaos, confusion, and a royal air with a lifelong fear of velvet. And so, the modesty curtain became a symbol of everything both glorious and ridiculous about Victorian royal life. An era determined to tame human nature with upholstery, moral panic, and a lot of fabric softener. So as you drift off tonight, free from the tyranny of curtains and prying eyes, be grateful for the luxury of privacy. And remember, sometimes the greatest barrier to passion is just a well-placed piece of cloth. It's time to talk about double standards, and in Victorian England, they weren't just common, they were practically an Olympic sport. In the palace, this meant one set of rules for kings and princes, and a whole other playbook for queens and princesses. Welcome to a world where forbidden desires existed everywhere, so long as you had the right title, or at least a good lawyer. If you're a royal man, let's be honest, temptation lurks behind every silk curtain. There are dashing actresses at the opera, mysterious dancers at masked balls, and the odd confidential companion whose job description is as vague as the Queen's recipe for punch. A prince's indiscretions are tolerated, even winked at, so long as he shows up for dinner, produces a few heirs, and avoids bankrupting the treasury with jewelry bills. Affairs? Well, those are romantic escapades, often solved with a polite transfer to the colonies or a generous wedding gift. If things get truly out of hand, a helpful advisor arranges for a discreet retirement to the countryside, where you can focus on agriculture and reflect on your actions. Everyone in the palace knows what's really going on. No one mentions it. Now, let's switch perspectives. If you're a royal woman, the rules are entirely different and a lot less fun. Your entire upbringing is a masterclass in reputation management. Your letters are censored, your movements chaperoned, and your choice of friends scrutinized with the thoroughness of a tax audit. The worst thing you can be isn't scandalous, but talked about. Even a hint of romantic interest, a blush at a ball, a stray glance at a cavalry officer, can launch a full-scale investigation by the royal household. Actual affairs? Forget it. The consequences are severe: exile, disgrace, or, for the unlucky, a permanent vacation to a distant European convent. Family meetings become interrogations. The Queen's silence becomes more terrifying than any royal decree. Worse yet, if there's even a rumor of an illegitimate child, the palace launches a cover-up so elaborate it makes Watergate look like a lost-and-found dispute at the local post office. All of this, of course, led to some world-class hypocrisy. The same courtiers who turned a blind eye to the king's nightly strolls would faint at the idea of a princess speaking to an unmarried man without a witness. Gossip was a weapon, and the palace was an echo chamber of secrets, lies, and clever excuses. Sometimes, the women rebelled in subtle ways: a coded letter, a secret rendezvous in the rose garden, or a sudden interest in botany lessons with the dashing young gardener. But the pressure was relentless. Royal women learned early to turn a smile into armor, to hide heartbreak under etiquette, and to channel their frustration into embroidery, piano practice, or passive-aggressive diary entries. Their desires became secrets, and their secrets became stories, whispered from one generation to the next. And yet, despite the odds, love still found a way. Royal daughters eloped with commoners. Queens carried on intellectual romances with foreign poets. And the odd princess left a diary behind that, to this day, gives historians heart palpitations. So, as you drift off, spare a thought for the women of the palace, masters of self-control, survivors of scandal, and pioneers of the side-eye. And remember, every double standard eventually becomes a bedtime story. Sometimes funny, sometimes tragic, and always, always worth whispering about, long after the candles have gone out. Now, let's dim the gaslights and tiptoe into the most anxiety-inducing subject in the palace after what's for dinner, birth control, or, as it was known in Victorian royal circles, prudent measures to encourage God's will, but only every other year. Because, in a world obsessed with heirs, producing too many could trigger a political crisis. But producing too few was the fast track to a royal performance review. First, understand that the Victorians were not lacking in creativity. They just lacked, well, effectiveness. The royal approach to family planning was a buffet of desperation, old wives' tales, and devices that belonged more in a mad scientist's lab than a marital bedroom. Let's start with the classics. Withdrawal and timing. Both required nerves of steel, military discipline, and a partner who understood that not tonight actually meant not ever, unless you want to explain yourself to the archbishop. The more scientific royals experimented with rhythm methods, carefully tracking lunar cycles, mysterious female tides, and any excuse to postpone a particularly awkward anniversary. Then there were the mechanical solutions. Victorian sheaths were made of anything on hand, linen, animal intestines, or, for the daring, oiled silk. Royals, having access to the very finest, sometimes requested custom-fitted contraceptives, hand-stitched by nervous palace seamstresses who had definitely not trained for this in finishing school. Unfortunately, quality control was inconsistent. The phrase user error might as well have been invented for the royal household, but if you wanted to get really creative or reckless, there were chemical methods, douching with vinegar, insertion of lemons, yes, actual lemons, and herbal concoctions brewed up by palace apothecaries. If it burned, stung, or left you unable to sit through dinner, it was probably considered effective. One princess was rumored to have experimented with a patented French sponge, only to require an urgent visit from the royal physician and a long, awkward explanation for why the linen closet suddenly smelled like citrus. And let's not forget the gadgets. The Victorians loved gadgets. There were intrauterine devices made from metal, glass, and in one case, what was later identified as a decorative hat pin. Some of these worked, most did not. Several simply exploded. Yes, exploded. There's a reason some rooms at Windsor Castle have scorch marks in very odd places. For all the danger, failure, and occasional property damage, the royal family still had one method more popular than all the rest. Denial. Absolute, straight-faced denial. When a new baby arrived, everyone feigned surprise. Who could have guessed, and quietly updated the line of succession? If an heir was not forthcoming, a solemn prayer was held, the Queen glared, and the royal physician reviewed his collection of pamphlets from Paris. There was, of course, the last resort, total abstinence. But in a world where every marriage was an international treaty and every bedroom a battlefield, no was rarely an option. Thus, royals persevered, balancing duty, desire, and a parade of dubious birth control, all while pretending that the stork really did handle these things after all. So, as you lie there tonight, grateful for modern science and the absence of vinegar-based contraptions under your pillow, remember, the greatest birth control in Victorian England wasn't a device, a potion, or a prayer. It was the overwhelming, paralyzing fear of another dinner with the Queen. If you ever wondered what it took to set the royal mood in Victorian England, prepare to be simultaneously amazed and horrified, because when it came to Aphrodisiacs, the palace's approach was leave no stone unturned and no barnyard animal untested. For the Victorians, romance was as much about the right lighting and poetry as it was about finding that perfect, possibly illegal, possibly deadly, elixir to restore vigor. And when you're the king or queen, there's always a chef, a courtier, or a traveling herbalist eager to recommend something new. Let's start with the classics. Oysters. The royal kitchen served them by the barrel, based on the enduring belief that their slippery texture and questionable smell were nature's promise of endless romance. No one actually liked the taste, but it was considered very continental. Next came chocolate, which was exotic, expensive, and, when melted, provided endless opportunities for awkward stains and apologetic letters to the laundry staff. Then there was champagne, Victorian England's favourite export from France. Champagne was the official drink of royal seduction. Bubbly, extravagant, and almost guaranteed to make you forget about the modesty curtain. Some royals preferred it in crystal goblets, others straight from the bottle, anything to loosen the corsets and inspire another entry in the family tree. For the more adventurous, There was a never-ending supply of herbal potions, ginseng from Asia, damiana from the Americas, and something ominous known only as Spanish fly, which, if taken in excess, could cause more medical emergencies than romantic encounters. Palace physicians were on permanent standby for digestive upsets and unexpected reactions. And then, in the true spirit of scientific inquiry, the Victorians turned to animal parts. Goat testicles, ground into powder and stirred into mulled wine, were all the rage in certain circles, promoted as the ultimate remedy for royal fatigue. No word on whether it worked, but there's plenty of evidence it inspired some very strange banquet conversations. Deer antler, powdered rhino horn when they could get it, and even the occasional sea cucumber, all graced the royal table, often disguised in soups that everyone politely pretended to enjoy. The less said about medicinal lozenges sold under the counter by apothecaries, the better. Let's just say some included enough opium to make you love absolutely everyone, and others left you unable to stand up for days. None of this, of course, was ever mentioned in polite society. If a royal was seen smiling too widely at dinner, a discreet note was passed to the physician, and the next course was quietly replaced with boiled mutton and strong tea. Despite the elaborate rituals, most royals admitted in private that a good night's sleep was a better aphrodisiac than anything imported from the colonies. Still, the tradition persisted, and palace kitchens stockpiled oysters, honey, cinnamon, and the world's most dubious bottles of special cordial, just in case duty called and the family needed another heir. So tonight, as you listen to the gentle hum of your fan and ponder the miracle of modern medicine, be grateful that your romantic evenings are free of goat testicles, suspicious lozenges, and the threat of a surprise visit from the royal physician. Sleep tight, and remember, sometimes the most seductive thing in the world is knowing that absolutely none of this is required. Let's pull back the velvet curtain carefully in case anyone's hiding behind it, and slip into the after-dark side of Victorian palace life. Because once the official state dinners were cleared, the gaslights dimmed, and the Queen had retreated to her diary, the real entertainment began. And let's just say, it wasn't always as dignified as the official portraits suggest. On the surface, court entertainments were designed to reinforce order, morality, and the sense that absolutely nobody was having any fun. But look a little closer, and you'll find that the Victorians, especially the royals, were masters of coded rebellion. The trick was to disguise your naughtiness as culture, and so, with a few strategic fan waves and a well-timed sonnet, even the most scandalous activities could be passed off as improving the mind. Take the tableaux vivants, for instance, a party favorite among the upper crust. In these living pictures, courtiers and sometimes royals themselves posed in elaborate scenes from mythology, literature, or, if the host was feeling cheeky, ancient Greek athletic contests. The catch: everyone was supposed to stay perfectly still, even if their costumes seemed to involve a suspicious lack of actual clothing, all in the name of art, of course. If anyone blushed, it was simply proof of their cultural ignorance. Then there were the masked balls, notorious for turning even the sternest noble into a secret flirt. Disguised in silk masks and peacock feathers, princes and princesses could dance, gossip, and occasionally disappear into the shrubbery with people their grandmothers would never have approved. No one admitted anything happened. The morning after, everyone blamed the champagne, the fog, and, if necessary, an outbreak of seasonal confusion. The Royal Theatre was another playground for double entendres. The Victorians loved Shakespeare, especially the parts he never meant for children. Comic operas and farces were chosen specifically for their layers of innuendo, which flew straight over the heads of visiting bishops, but kept the back row of courtiers cackling. If the Queen frowned, someone added more Latin. And let's not forget the musicians, jugglers, and guest performers imported from the continent. Rumour had it, more than one foreign violinist earned a generous tip for services rendered after the curtain fell. When the court was truly bored, they held mock trials. The accused might be a courtier suspected of excessive charm or flirting with the Duchess's poodle. The sentence? A forfeit, a silly dance, or, on one legendary evening, a serenade performed while wearing nothing but a strategically draped flag. But perhaps the most outrageous entertainments were private and unrecorded, taking place in side chambers, moonlit gardens, or the mysterious gentlemen's reading rooms that contained not a single book. There, reputations were gambled, secrets traded, and the occasional heart broken. Everything was denied, of course, until the next rumor surfaced, and the whole cycle started again. By day, the palace was a fortress of manners. By night, it was a carnival of whispered jokes, dangerous liaisons, and the kind of laughter that made everyone sleep a little more soundly, or not at all. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the gentle rustle of silk, the distant sound of laughter, and the comforting knowledge that no matter how proper things looked on the outside, inside every royal palace was a circus just waiting for the lights to go down. Let's switch gears and slip behind the scenes, to a world the history books rarely discuss, the lives of royal servants, specifically the unlucky few whose job descriptions went way beyond carrying trays or fluffing pillows. Welcome to the awkward, unfiltered reality of intimate service, Victorian style. Every royal household was a sprawling machine of etiquette, with layers of staff dedicated to the care and feeding of its regal residents. At the pinnacle of discretion stood a position both revered and dreaded: the groom of the stool. Yes, you heard that right. His job, at its core, was to manage the king's, let's say, personal evacuations. If you think your work meetings are awkward, try holding a silk handkerchief and a silver chamber pot while the monarch does his business and updates you on foreign policy. The groom of the stool's duties ranged from wiping and cleaning to monitoring the royal digestion, offering gentle conversation, and sometimes even acting as a private secretary. There was no job more trusted. Secrets were exchanged, alliances formed, and on more than one occasion, state documents were signed on the nearest available surface. Sometimes while the king was still in mid-process, but the groom wasn't alone in the pantheon of awkward occupations. The keeper of the royal nightshirt was responsible for organizing sleepwear, ensuring each garment was properly warmed by the fire and laid out with military precision. The Queen's bath attendant managed the delicate process of filling, testing, and occasionally entering the bath before Her Majesty, just to make sure the water was non-lethal. Footmen delivered love letters, chambermaids changed the infamous modesty curtain, and one unlucky under-butler specialized in dusting the royal collection off, let's just say, personal massage implements. In a palace where privacy was a myth, these servants saw and heard everything. Romantic quarrels, reconciliations, and the sound of a prince tripping over a misplaced chamber pot at 3 a.m. Gossip was currency, but so was silence. The highest praise a servant could earn was, "You never saw a thing," the worst fate, becoming the main character in a scandalous court poem. Some servants even developed specialties in crisis management. There was the bed tester to ensure the royal mattress was free of lumps and over-enthusiastic mice, the corset lacer, whose knots could withstand a minor siege, and the royal perfumer, always on standby after a hearty dinner. For many, promotion came not from skill, but from the ability to keep a straight face during emergencies, like when a visiting ambassador mistook the Queen's medicinal ointment for clotted cream. Yet, for all the indignities, these intimate servants wielded real power. They could whisper warnings, deliver messages, or grant access to rooms where official history was never written. A well-timed tip from the groom of the stool could make or break a political career. And let's be honest, if you can keep your composure while holding a chamber pot and maintaining eye contact with the monarch, you can probably handle anything life throws at you. Tonight, as you relax in privacy, maybe with a favorite pillow and not a single servant in sight, offer a silent salute to those unsung heroes of palace life. The next time you think your job is awkward, just remember, at least you don't have to warm the royal nightshirt or keep a ledger of the Queen's preferred bath temperatures. Sleep well, and may all your dreams be mercifully free of silver chamber pots. If you thought your last family reunion was awkward, spare a thought for the Victorians, whose most eligible bachelors and bachelorettes all shared at least one set of grandparents. Welcome to the royal tradition of marrying cousins, a matchmaking strategy that was less about passion and more about preserving the family tree. Even if that tree started looking more like a wreath, the Victorian age was a golden era for royal inbreeding, and nobody played the game quite like Queen Victoria herself. She and Prince Albert were first cousins, an arrangement so common in European courts that it was considered, if anything, a bit boring. Their marriage was celebrated as both a love story and a diplomatic triumph, with portraits, poems, and the occasional snide letter from a distant relative who hadn't been invited to the wedding, possibly because they were also up for the groom's hand. The logic behind all this cousin courting was simple: keep power in the family and keep outsiders outside. It was the royal version of don't talk to strangers, except the strangers were usually minor princes from obscure German duchies with suspicious facial hair. Alliances were strengthened, titles consolidated, and dinner conversation kept delightfully predictable, since everyone already knew each other's secrets, scandals, and embarrassing baby stories. But there were, of course, consequences. The gene pool in Victorian royal circles got about as shallow as the decorative fountains in Buckingham Palace. Medical oddities began to pop up, from haemophilia, the so-called royal disease, to the world's most magnificent collection of jutting chins, pointy noses, and family portraits that required a legend to explain who wasn't married to whom. Doctors noticed, but etiquette demanded silence. It was far more polite to blame a family tendency toward the vapors than to suggest that maybe, just maybe, a bit of genetic diversity would do the trick. Still, the weddings went on. Invitations were sent to every corner of Europe, sometimes twice, just in case a cousin showed up under two different titles. The ceremonies were lavish, with white dresses, gold lace, and enough fruitcake to stun a medium-sized horse. Guests smiled, kissed cheeks, and whispered in at least 3 languages about who might be next, always secretly relieved if the chosen partner was only a second cousin. Behind the scenes, young royals often dreamed of forbidden romance. A dashing guard, a governess with excellent cheekbones, or even, scandal of scandals, someone with absolutely no family connection at all. Occasionally, one would rebel and elope, triggering panic, diplomatic incidents, and hastily written laws forbidding imprudent affection. But most bowed to duty, exchanging vows, rings, and inherited medical conditions with the resigned grace of someone who knows they'll see their spouse at the next family picnic anyway. Today, we may shake our heads and thank genetics for our diverse dating apps. But in the palace, marrying cousins was less a taboo than a tradition. It was the ultimate royal romance. Predictable, practical, and perfect for anyone who wanted to keep their inheritance and their secrets, all in the family. As you drift off tonight, wrapped in your own blissfully unrelated sheets, be grateful that your family tree probably branches more than once. And remember, sometimes true love really is just a matter of knowing which side of the table to sit on at dinner. Now that you've made it through the cuisine-filled wedding season, let's peek into the palace infirmary, where every sniffle, limp, and mysterious rash came with a side of royal panic. Inbreeding wasn't just a romantic inconvenience, it was a medical minefield. And the Victorian royals were the poster children for maybe don't marry your aunt's son. First, the showstopper, haemophilia, sometimes called the royal disease. Queen Victoria, bless her relentlessly matchmaking heart, became a genetic carrier for this rare bleeding disorder. She passed it on to several of her descendants, who then married into the ruling families of Spain, Germany, and Russia, accidentally creating an international league of children who could bruise at the sight of a stiff breeze. Royal physicians responded by inventing ever more creative excuses for why young princes spent so much time sitting quietly and wearing suspicious amounts of padding, but hemophilia was just the most famous in a parade of palace peculiarities. Portraits from the period are a treasure trove of hints: protruding jaws, the famous Habsburg jaw, narrow palates, wonky knees, and that one prince who required custom-made shoes for his 6.5 toes. If you read between the lines of royal diaries, you'll find references to delicate constitutions, peculiar tendencies, and the always mysterious nervous conditions that made family gatherings so lively. Doctors of the era, armed with leeches, laudanum, and wishful thinking, were in constant demand. Each royal birth prompted frantic consultations and the occasional international incident. Was it a cold? Or the start of another inherited crisis? Was the limp from a playground accident? Or had cousin Edwina's left eyebrow finally met its genetic match? Medical records, if kept, were promptly hidden in locked drawers, and anyone asking too many questions was quietly assigned to manage the palace's swan population. As for treatments, let's just say the options were limited. When genetics handed you a short straw, the Victorian solution was to consult a bishop, pray, and commission a flattering new portrait. If that failed, there was always a marriage to another distant cousin in a hope that somehow 2 wrongs might eventually make a right. Despite the best efforts of the court's doctors, midwives, and homeopaths, the real cure for royal ailments turned out to be time, and a gradual realization that, just maybe, a wider dating pool was a good idea. Eventually, later generations got the message, and the European aristocracy's medical mysteries became the subject of medical textbooks, daytime documentaries, and the occasional pub quiz. So tonight, as you stretch your limbs and thank your ancestors for leaving their villages at least once, rest easy knowing that the modern royal family tree is a little less circular. Sometimes, history really does learn from its mistakes, one genetic revelation at a time. Let's slip into the softly lamplit corners of the Victorian palace, where medical science meets social anxiety, and everyone's favorite diagnosis is hysteria. If you were a royal woman in the 19th century and feeling anything other than cheerful, sad, tired, angry, or, heaven forbid, opinionated, you were probably suffering from a bad case of the vapors, nervous prostration, or just plain hysteria. Hysteria was the era's catch-all for any inconvenient female emotion. Feeling irritable? Hysteria. Can't sleep? Hysteria. Asked too many questions about royal finances? Definitely hysteria. And while royal men were sometimes diagnosed with melancholia or nervous exhaustion, it was women who bore the brunt of the medical imagination. Enter the palace physicians, armed with a dazzling array of dubious therapies. There were herbal tonics, fainting couches, and the world's least relaxing bath salts. But the real pièce de résistance was the hysteria chair. This contraption, equal parts furniture and torture device, vibrated, rocked, or spun you until you either felt better or decided to never mention your symptoms again. And the treatments didn't end there. There were vibrating belts, electric wands, and manual therapy, all administered by men with large moustaches and a very vague grasp of anatomy. If a royal lady complained of restlessness, she might be subjected to pelvic massage, a procedure that, astonishingly, sometimes worked, mostly by causing the patient to fall asleep out of pure embarrassment. Physicians kept detailed logs of successful paroxysms, and patent medicine salesmen made fortunes selling their devices to hopeful aristocrats all over Europe. But hysteria wasn't always about gadgets. Sometimes it was about ritual. A day in bed, a parade of sympathetic visitors, a new silk shawl, or the comforting sound of the Queen's favorite corgi snoring nearby. Rest cures were all the rage, though rest usually meant total isolation, no books, and being force-fed broth by a stern nurse. Hysteria was also the perfect excuse to avoid unpleasant social events. Sorry, can't attend the cousin's wedding, I'm in the throes of nervous exhaustion. Of course, not everyone played along. Some royal women learned to wield their condition as a tool, escaping obligations, manipulating family politics, or simply getting an extra serving of dessert. It became an open secret. Too much embroidery? Hysteria. Bored by the bishop's sermon? Hysteria. Overheard giggling with a dashing footman? Hysteria, with a side order of moral panic. All the while, the palace's male doctors congratulated themselves on their scientific approach, unaware that most of their treatments were about as effective as a wet tea towel. The real therapy, as always, was a friend, a warm bath, and maybe the chance to speak one's mind without a committee of anxious uncles taking notes. Eventually, medical science moved on, but not before the Victorians left behind an impressive collection of vibrating chairs, embroidered nervous disorder samplers, and enough misunderstood diaries to keep historians busy for centuries. So tonight, as you lie in bed, no vibrating furniture in sight, breathe easy and remember. Sometimes the best cure for a case of nerves is a good laugh, a cozy blanket, and the comforting knowledge that the only thing spinning in your room is the ceiling fan. If the palace walls could talk, they'd probably start with a cough, blush deeply, and change the subject. Because hidden beneath all the layers of velvet and respectability was a whole shadow world of royal escapades, a side of Victorian England rarely recorded in official histories, but whispered about in every smoky club and behind every fluttering fan. You see, for all the sermons and etiquette books, London's brothels were thriving, and not just among the lower classes. The royal family, their cousins, and an endless cast of ambitious courtiers had a long-standing relationship with the city's finest and not-so-fine establishments. Some brothels were practically institutions, discreet, luxurious, and conveniently located within carriage distance of Buckingham Palace. The most prestigious ones even kept private ledgers, with code names for their most illustrious clients. The stammering lord, the eager marquess, and, rumour has it, a mysterious Prince S, whose tastes included late-night chess, whipped cream, and never being asked about his job. The brothels themselves were little kingdoms, each with its own rituals and hierarchies. New arrivals were trained in the art of discretion, never gossip, never ask questions, and always remember which client likes his brandy warmed and which one prefers to keep his boots on. Some offered themed evenings for the more adventurous, Greek mythology, French masquerade, or, on one infamous occasion, a night at the House of Lords. There was a wig surcharge. For the royal family, a brothel visit was both a risk and a relief. Here, under the protection of a false name and a velvet mask, a prince or a bored dowager duchess could indulge in desires never spoken of at court. Of course, discretion came at a price. More than one scandal was averted with hush money, a discreet transfer to the colonies, or the sudden appearance of a very expensive painting gifted to the chief of police. Occasionally the cover-ups failed. Newspapers hinted at noble indiscretions, courtiers disappeared overnight, and the Queen was once heard to exclaim, "Not again," during a cabinet meeting. No one dared ask. The brothel files grew, quietly edited, and eventually locked away in private archives. Historians still debate the true extent of royal involvement, but one thing is certain. Victorian virtue was flexible if you could pay the right price. Still, the brothel world had its own hazards. Blackmail was always a risk. Unscrupulous madams, embittered rivals, and enterprising journalists all kept their eyes open for anything that might fetch a fortune at the gossip sheets. A single misplaced glove or a too recognizable signet ring could unravel an entire career, or, at the very least, make for a very awkward family dinner. So, as you drift off tonight, ponder the hidden chapters of royal history. Behind every moral crusade and starched collar was a bustling network of shadowy escapades, scandalous rendezvous, and secrets that, if ever revealed, would have made even Queen Victoria drop her teacup. Sleep well, and remember, in Victorian England, the truth always wore a mask. Let's slip out the back door of the palace tonight, careful not to trip over the corgis, and find ourselves in the moonlit gardens where royal hearts did what royal rules forbade. They fell in love with the wrong people, because for every arranged marriage inked in a treaty, there was a forbidden affair written in invisible ink, somewhere between the rose bushes and the linen closets. Victorian royalty loved their scandals almost as much as their formal titles. With the world watching every move, and an entire staff dedicated to making sure nothing exciting ever happened, it's a wonder anyone managed to meet anyone at all, let alone fall passionately, recklessly, and disastrously in love. But oh, they did. And with the palace packed tighter than a steamer trunk at the start of the social season, privacy was always just out of reach. Royal lovers came in all forms. Dashing footmen, clever governesses, mysterious foreign envoys, and the odd stable boy who looked particularly good in breeches. Some affairs were barely hidden, smuggled love letters under silver serving trays, sudden interest in late-night library study, and the famous case of the princess who was always taking her embroidery out for a walk. Sometimes, the entire palace knew before breakfast. The butlers kept secrets, the maids swapped rumors, and the queen, with a sigh, quietly requested stronger locks on the garden gates. For royals, falling in love outside the family's carefully drawn lines was dangerous. If discovered, the best-case scenario was exile to a minor estate in the Scottish Highlands. Plenty of heather, very little scandal. The worst case? Forced separation, public disgrace, or being written out of the royal family's official story with the efficiency of a palace secretary wielding a very sharp quill. And yet, passion found a way. Royals wrote secret diaries in invisible ink, sent coded messages through flower arrangements, and enlisted loyal confidants to act as go-betweens. There were secret meetings at masked balls, moonlit rides on the palace grounds, and, for the truly daring, midnight swims in the ornamental lake. A bold move, considering Victorian swimwear involved enough fabric to capsize a rowboat. Not all forbidden loves were doomed. Some blossomed into lifelong secret partnerships, supported by palace insiders who understood the value of a happy royal, even if it meant pretending not to notice the prince and the portrait artist spending a suspicious amount of time together. Others ended in heartbreak, scandal, and the kind of regret best drowned in tea and melancholy poetry. A few royal affairs made their way into public gossip, hinted at in cartoons, satirical plays, or coded jokes at society dinners. The palace denied everything, of course. Purely platonic, the official statement would insist, as the princess blushed and the footman suddenly discovered a new posting in Canada. In the end, forbidden love added a human touch to the palace's marble corridors. It proved that beneath all the rules, titles, and velvet curtains, royals were just as prone to impulsive decisions, awkward misunderstandings, and the irresistible urge to sneak out after curfew as the rest of us. So as you close your eyes, imagine the hush of the palace at midnight, the flutter of secret notes, and the hope that, just maybe, love is worth a little trouble, even if it means braving the wrath of the queen and the gossip of the footman. If you think dating is awkward now, imagine trying to navigate romance with a rulebook thicker than a Victorian sofa and a household staff ready to judge your every move. In the world of royal etiquette, even kissing came with instructions, consequences, and the ever-present risk of accidentally setting off a diplomatic incident. Victorian England believed in rules, and nowhere were they more confounding than in matters of the heart. For the royal family, public displays of affection were practically treasonous. A handshake was risque, a hug scandalous, and a kiss, well. A kiss was an event worthy of national headlines. Let's start with the basics: who, where, and how. Royals were permitted to kiss only close family, and only on the cheek, and even then only after checking the latest guidelines from the Lord Chamberlain's office. Anything more, say, The faintest suggestion of lips meeting in daylight required chaperones, an official blessing, and possibly a short constitutional crisis. Courtship rituals were designed to keep things as unromantic as possible. Couples courted under the watchful eye of chaperones, engaged in meaningful glances from opposite ends of the room, and, if lucky, held gloved hands in the garden while reciting poetry about mutual disappointment. The first kiss often took place after the wedding, with an audience of relatives pretending to look away but secretly keeping score. The pressure was immense, which perhaps explains why so many Victorian kisses were described as brief, dutiful, or best left to the imagination. Instructional books abounded, helpfully outlining the proper technique for royal kissing. There were tips on posture, upright and alert, duration, momentary, never lingering, and even breath control mint, if available. Otherwise, prayer. Mistakes were inevitable. If one leaned too far in, there was the risk of bonnets colliding, noses being bumped, or, in one legendary case, a tiara sent flying into a nearby soup tureen. Rumors flew about the few royals who dared to break protocol, a prince caught smooching behind the drapes, a duchess who initiated a kiss in full view of a footman, the scandal, and an heir to the throne who allegedly kissed his fiancée's hand without gloves. Each story triggered waves of pearl clutching, anonymous letters to the Times, and hasty edits to the royal etiquette manual. Unsurprisingly, this repressive climate didn't exactly encourage skillful romance. If modern British kissing is sometimes described as reserved, blames centuries of ancestors who approached intimacy like a diplomatic negotiation. After all, nobody wants to end up in the tower because their lips lingered a second too long. And yet, against all odds, some managed to sneak in moments of genuine affection, a stolen kiss on the terrace, a hurried peck before the carriage ride, a loving embrace when no one was watching, except the Queen's favourite Pekingese. Each one, a small victory, proof that love sometimes outpaces even the strictest rulebook. Tonight, as you drift off, be glad your most awkward kisses are not the subject of international protocol. And if you do dream of royal romance, may it involve more passion and fewer official observers. Sleep well, and remember, the best kisses are the ones nobody bothers to regulate. If there's one thing the Victorians loved even more than a wedding, it was a good old-fashioned scandal. And nothing kept the rumour mills grinding quite like the sudden appearance of a royal love child. Because in a palace full of rules, locked doors, and cousins who all looked suspiciously alike, the biggest secret of all was the existence of surprise heirs. The mechanics of royal secrecy were astonishing. First, there was the careful choreography of court life. Every royal pregnancy was tracked, timed, and announced with the precision of a military campaign. When a baby arrived outside this schedule, born to the wrong mother, at the wrong time, or in the wrong country, palace officials went into full lockdown mode. Maids were shuffled to remote estates. Doctors were sworn to silence. Servants who talked too much found themselves reassigned to the royal poultry division, a fate worse than exile. Sometimes, the love child was whisked away before the ink was dry on the birth certificate. Discreet adoptions were arranged, with the child raised by trusted friends or distant relatives in the countryside. In rare cases, the child grew up in the palace itself, quietly passed off as a ward, godchild, or promising young equestrian, while everyone agreed not to notice the strong resemblance to a certain member of the royal household. The rumours, of course, were relentless. The press speculated. Court painters subtly retouched family portraits, and one notorious biographer made a career out of counting royal chins and matching them to local orphans. Queen Victoria herself was famously strict about maintaining the family's reputation, no matter how many inconvenient babies turned up at Christmas time. Official statements were issued, all saying precisely nothing, and the public was left to fill in the gaps with their wildest imaginings. The love child problem wasn't limited to kings or princes. Princesses, duchesses, and even a few ambitious ladies-in-waiting occasionally found themselves facing a delicate situation. The double standard meant that a royal man's indiscretions were excused as youthful exuberance, while a woman risked social ruin, exile, or a quiet retirement to a villa in Italy. But sometimes, a love child grew up and quietly joined the ranks of respectable society, never officially recognized, but always curiously well-connected. There were stories of mysterious cousins who inherited country houses, or wards who became trusted royal advisors. Historians still pore over letters and diaries, searching for evidence, while conspiracy theorists draw elaborate family trees connecting every ginger-haired aristocrat from here to Vienna. Of course, for every real love child, there were a dozen invented by the tabloids, eager to sell papers and keep the public's imagination fired up. Some supposed royal offspring went on to lead perfectly ordinary lives, never knowing just how many people thought they had a secret claim to the throne. Others, more enterprising, used the rumors to get free drinks in the best London clubs. In the end, the mysterious case of the royal love child was less about scandal and more about the palace's desperate attempts to appear perfect. Behind every curtain, beneath every starched tablecloth, was the unspoken truth that royals were only human, sometimes a little too human for the official record. So as you doze off tonight, ponder the power of secrets, the art of discretion, and the possibility that the next time you bump into a charming stranger with remarkable cheekbones, you might just be shaking hands with history's greatest cover-up. In Victorian England, sex wasn't just a physical act. It was a spiritual battleground, and the palace was the front line. The royal cult of purity wasn't limited to the Queen's diaries or the way everyone covered their table legs with crocheted doilies. It shaped the way entire generations thought about love, marriage, and the mysterious workings of the human body. The guiding principle was simple. Purity was next to godliness, and a spotless reputation was the ultimate royal accessory. Young royals were drilled in self-control, piety, and the art of never letting anyone know what they were actually thinking. Lessons began early, with nannies enforcing bedtime prayers and lectures about the dangers of idle hands. Bishops visited often, delivering sermons that managed to make even lemonade sound vaguely sinful. As children grew, so did the restrictions. Princesses took purity pledges, vowing to keep their thoughts chaste and their ankles hidden until marriage, and preferably a few years after. Princes were told to focus on duty, service, and the study of worthy pursuits, which conveniently left no time for worldly temptations. If anyone showed the slightest interest in romance, they were sent for extra Latin lessons, which worked better than cold showers. Court life revolved around maintaining appearances. Balls and dances were strictly chaperoned, with every guest carefully vetted and every dance card monitored for potential outbreaks of flirtation. If two young people were caught giggling behind a curtain, a senior relative materialized instantly with a stern look and a 500-page etiquette manual. Love letters were intercepted, censored, and, if deemed too expressive, returned with corrections in red ink. For the especially devout, there were prayer groups, midnight vigils, and moral inventories, an annual tradition where everyone was expected to confess, in writing, how many times they had strayed in thought. The answers were often creative. One prince once listed thinking about cheese as his greatest failing, just to be safe. But underneath the purity campaign pulsed a river of anxiety. The royals knew that all eyes were on them, and any hint of scandal could shake the empire. This fear produced a culture of repression, whispered secrets, and the constant, exhausting work of pretending. Some coped by burying themselves in charity work, good deeds, or, in a few cases, very long novels about swans. Others rebelled quietly, sending each other coded glances at church, or sneaking away for moonlit strolls with forbidden partners. In time, many Victorians realized that purity was a noble goal, but impossible to police. Even the Queen, after decades of promoting spotless morals, confessed in her old age that young people will always find a way. The cult of purity faded, replaced by a gentler kind of spirituality, one that made room for love, forgiveness, and the simple, honest truth that nobody's soul is as spotless as their gloves. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let go of perfection. Forget the rules, the chaperones, and the anxious bishops. In the end, the only purity that matters is the comfort of a quiet conscience, the warmth of being known, and the peace that comes from loving and living with your whole, complicated, very human heart. Congratulations! You've survived another royal evening of marital duty, candlelit intrigue, and enough etiquette to choke a bishop. But in the Victorian palace, even the afterglow comes with paperwork, because nothing, absolutely nothing, was too private to escape the attentions of the royal record keepers. Every royal encounter, no matter how clandestine or cringe-inducing, ran the risk of ending up in a diary, a medical report, or a quietly circulated memo. The Victorians were obsessed with documentation. Queen Victoria herself filled thousands of pages with reflections on her private life, sometimes in excruciating detail, sometimes in code, always with an eye to future historians who might one day try to piece together the real story. Albert looked at me with such affection tonight, she'd write, followed by a paragraph of underlining and a suspiciously cheerful exclamation mark. But it wasn't just the Queen. Princes, princesses, and their assorted staff were all chroniclers at heart. Some kept diaries, others preferred letters. A few trusted their memories to the family doctor, who would dutifully record all relevant events, a phrase that covered everything from stomachaches to sudden bursts of enthusiasm beneath the counterpane. In the age of propriety, the line between confession and self-incrimination was thin indeed. And let's not forget the palace's official chroniclers. The secretaries, chaplains, and private secret agents who were tasked with keeping the annals of the realm tidy. They edited, censored, and, when things got truly out of hand, simply omitted. An inconvenient love affair? Edited into a spiritual friendship. An unfortunate outbreak of passion? Referred to as a period of increased domesticity. When in doubt, use more Latin. Yet for all this documentation, the truth rarely stayed hidden. Servants gossiped. Politicians whispered. The press, hungry for scandal, sometimes intercepted a discarded love note or a misplaced doctor's bill. Rumors filtered through the palace walls faster than a draft in winter. By the time a royal event was officially recorded, it had usually already been exaggerated, sanitized, and immortalized as both a cautionary tale and a punchline. Of course, this endless record-keeping took its toll. Some royals developed a lifelong fear of writing anything down. One prince famously refused to sign birthday cards, lest they end up as evidence. Others embraced the surveillance, using their journals as therapy, self-defense, or an alibi. At 11:12 p.m., I was definitely alone reading scripture with a chaperone. Absolutely nothing else occurred. Occasionally, a particularly bold royal would use their letters to confess, apologize, or even gloat, secure in the knowledge that, one day, their side of the story might finally be told. But for every moment captured in ink, countless others slipped by, unrecorded except in memory or in the subtle glances exchanged across a candlelit room. That's the bittersweet truth of royal life. Even in a world obsessed with documentation, the most important things, the genuine love, the regret, the small acts of rebellion, often went unwritten, and maybe that's just as well. So, as you settle into your own quiet afterglow tonight, free from chroniclers and palace gossips, take comfort in the privacy of your own thoughts, and the peaceful certainty that you'll never have to explain yourself in Latin. Let your day's triumphs and embarrassments drift away, unreported, unjudged, and entirely your own. Sleep well, and may all your regrets be brief, your memories gentle, and your dreams blissfully undocumented. Imagine it. You're a newly minted Victorian royal, standing in a lavish candlelit bedroom, surrounded by heavy velvet curtains, ominous family portraits, and at least 4 monogrammed towels you're not sure you're actually allowed to use. You've survived the wedding, the banquets, and the endless processions. Now comes the part nobody prepared you for, except, of course, the entire British Empire, which is waiting with bated breath for proof that the marriage has been properly consummated. The royal wedding night was less an intimate occasion and more a public performance conducted in private. There were rules, so many rules, and a protocol so elaborate it made chess look like checkers. Instruction manuals were distributed to nervous brides and grooms, discreetly printed and bound in black leather, with chapters like On the Harmonious Union of Flesh and Duty and What to Do if You've Never Seen a Naked Person, including yourself. For many, the wedding night began with panic. Whispered prayers, furtive glances, and a quick scan of the room for hidden observers. The palace staff swore they never spied. But let's be honest. There was always at least one over-curious footman loitering outside the door, just in case a witness was required for the legal bit. In some cases, a senior courtier or even a priest lingered nearby, ready to sign off on the royal deed, without actually witnessing anything, but definitely listening for suggestive rustling. The instruction manual's advice was rarely helpful. New couples, trained to avoid even eye contact at the dinner table, now faced a step-by-step guide full of phrases like approach with dignity, do not alarm your spouse, and seek mutual understanding through gentle inquiry. If all else failed, there was always the advice to consult the physician. Nothing sets the mood like a man in a monocle with a checklist. And let's not forget the practical obstacles. Multiple layers of clothing had to be negotiated. Corsets, chemises, petticoats, nightshirts, and, in some cases, ceremonial sashes that refused to come untied. The average undressing could take half an hour, with pauses for water breaks and the occasional existential crisis. By the time both parties were finally delayed, the only thing hotter than the room was the mounting sense of dread. For many, the experience was a bewildering blur, a mixture of duty, curiosity, embarrassment, and the unshakable sense that everyone else probably had a much better idea of what was supposed to happen. Diaries from the era are full of veiled references to a most unusual evening. An attempt was made. Or, in one famous instance, matters proceeded with admirable reserve. Success was measured not in passion, but in the presence of a reassuringly official bloodstain on the royal bedsheet. The original evidence-based policy. Afterward, relief mingled with regret and a kind of exhausted triumph. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting collected the linens, the footmen exchanged knowing glances, and the happy couple retreated to their separate corners of the enormous marital bed, already thinking about tomorrow's breakfast. In the end, the royal wedding night was rarely romantic, occasionally comic, and always legendary. For every disastrous story, there was a sweet one, a shy couple finding common ground in laughter, a thoughtful spouse offering reassurance, or 2 nervous royals agreeing to just pretend the whole thing never happened. So, as you drift into sleep, be grateful that your own awkward firsts were private, unrecorded, and entirely free of official instruction manuals. After all, some experiences are best left between the sheets and out of the state archives. Now that the wedding night is over, let's get cozy, not with a lover, but with the real star of the Victorian royal bedtime routine. Pajamas. You might imagine that the rich and powerful just threw on a nightshirt and called it a day. Oh no. Royal sleepwear was governed by its own arcane code, a set of unwritten laws that kept everyone covered, dignified, and deeply uncomfortable. First, you had to understand the layers. Royals never slept in anything as simple as pajamas. Instead, there was a whole wardrobe: linen nightshirts, silk nightgowns, embroidered caps, cashmere socks, and, if you were really feeling daring, a bed jacket trimmed with lace. Some favored flannel for warmth, others preferred cotton, starched within an inch of its life. For the truly fashionable, there were monogrammed slippers and matching eye masks, perfect for the insomniac prince with a keen sense of personal branding. The unwritten laws dictated not just what to wear, but when and with whom. Night attire was to be selected based on the season, the status of any potential visitors, expected or not, and the likelihood of having to evacuate the palace in the middle of the night because of a suspicious cheese soufflé in the royal kitchens. One must never, ever be seen in their private pajamas by anyone except the most trusted personal valet, the royal physician, in cases of medical emergency only, and, on rare occasions, a spouse, provided all curtains were drawn and chaperones were posted outside. Color mattered too. Pastels signaled innocence and calm, while darker shades denoted authority and, according to palace law, promoted restful dreams. Bold patterns were reserved for jovial occasions like birthdays or impending coronations. Pajamas with visible patches were strictly forbidden, better to freeze than risk looking like the staff. But the most important law was that pajamas, once worn, became a kind of personal armor. In a palace where privacy was an illusion and servants could appear at any moment to stoke the fire or fetch a forgotten book, pajamas shielded their wearers from embarrassment and unsolicited advice. There are stories of kings refusing to receive ambassadors until they'd changed into the proper night attire, and queens refusing to take breakfast unless their slippers matched their robe. Even royal children weren't exempt. Nighttime tantrums could be triggered by the wrong set of flannel bloomers, and more than one future monarch practiced their first regal decree by banning itchy pajamas from the nursery. The etiquette extended to bedtime routines. Never enter another royal's chamber unannounced after dusk. Always knock twice, once for courtesy, once for dignity. If caught in a nightshirt by anyone other than family, apologize profusely and send a handwritten note of regret. And above all, never, ever discuss another person's sleepwear in public, unless you're prepared to duel at dawn with silver-backed hairbrushes. So, as you snuggle into whatever feels right tonight, bask in the luxury of being unobserved, unregulated, and absolutely free to mix stripes and polka dots if you want. Because in your kingdom, there's only one rule of pajamas. Comfort reigns. Let's dim the gas lights and enter the most mysterious territory of all. The royal bedroom, after dark, where logic gives way to superstition, and every bit of nightly ritual is performed with the earnestness of a cathedral choir. Because if you thought royal protocol was strict, just wait until you see what Victorians believed about what could go wrong at bedtime. First, a warning. Don't touch the curtains. Not the heavy velvet ones that keep out the morning sun and the prying eyes of passing servants, but the gauzy, thin bed drapes. Palace folklore insisted that these curtains, if brushed the wrong way after midnight, might summon bad dreams, encourage ghosts, or at the very least, guarantee a terrible hair day. Some royal children grew up convinced that to so much as flick a tassel after dusk was to invite a parade of ancestral spirits to your pillow. The superstitions didn't end there. Royals slept facing north, never south, because everyone knew that the dead lay with their heads to the north, and anything else was inviting confusion in the afterlife. To ward off nightmares, a pair of slippers, left foot, then right, had to be placed neatly at the bedside, toes pointing east, so the sun would shine away the shadows in the morning. If you woke up and your slippers had been knocked askew, better cancel the coronation. Nothing good was coming that day. Mirrors were strictly covered at night. It was believed that mirrors could trap wandering spirits or, more alarmingly, reflect your own restless dreams back at you, leaving you exhausted and possibly a little haunted by your own reflection. Staff dutifully draped every looking-glass in the royal chambers with lace shawls or, for the more superstitious, with black silk. Even the cats avoided the mirrors after midnight. Fresh flowers in the bedroom? Only certain kinds. Lilies, for purity. lavender for restful sleep, never roses, they might invite heartbreak, or ferns, which were considered busybody plants, prone to gossip. If your bouquet wilted overnight, the only solution was to sleep with a Bible under your pillow and refuse all visitors until the third day. Windows, too, had rules. Open them just a crack for healthful air, but never enough for the night vapors to drift in. A window left unlatched was blamed for everything from toothaches to romantic misfortune. And, of course, never, ever leave a comb on the windowsill, unless you wanted to wake up with tangled hair and even more tangled royal relationships. Every evening unfolded like a slow-motion ballet of tucking, draping, and strategic muttering. Servants recited little charms. Sleep sweet, and may all bad dreams find another door. Maids double-checked that no bed springs creaked, a sure omen of family discord, and the most anxious royals clutched amulets, saints' medals, or, in a few cases, a handwritten list of names of people they wanted to dream about. And, of course, no bedtime ritual was complete without a glass of water, poured only halfway to prevent overflowing emotions in the night. A royal who forgot their water risked tossing and turning, plagued by thirsty dreams and the certainty that the day ahead would be filled with petty annoyances and unsolvable crossword puzzles. Tonight, as you slip beneath your own comforter, no drapes to dodge, no flowers to fear, give thanks for your freedom from nightly rituals and haunted mirrors. Remember, the only superstition you need now is the one that says, if you close your eyes and wish for good dreams, they just might come true. Now, let's wander quietly down the palace hallways, past snoring footmen and the soft tick of the royal grandfather clock, and peek into the world of royal children, their virtue carefully curated by anxious parents, but their actual education far more interesting than anyone dared admit. The official story. Royal children were the epitome of innocence, raised in a hothouse of morals, manners, and monogrammed linen handkerchiefs. Nannies taught prayers and posture. Governesses enforced spelling bees, thank you letters, and the fine art of not making a face at cabbage soup. Every hour of the day was scheduled, monitored, and sanitized. The only thing more precious than their virtue was the public's belief in it. But behind the scenes, palace life was its own kind of school, and not always the one described in etiquette manuals. Royals were assigned secret tutors for all sorts of purposes. Officially, it was for language, music, or fencing. Unofficially, the tutors were sometimes selected for their skill in navigating the more delicate subjects, romance, self-control, or, in the case of especially inquisitive princes, the art of not getting caught sneaking biscuits after lights out. These tutors were sworn to secrecy and paid well for their silence. Some were eccentric professors from the continent, others disgraced aristocrats, hoping to win favor, or at least a good reference. Their lessons ranged from the classics, Latin, Greek, and the family tree, in painful detail, to more practical concerns. How to write a discreet love note, what not to say to the archbishop, and how to escape through the servants' stairwell if an urgent walk was needed after dark. The palace kept up appearances with regular reports of exemplary conduct. But the truth was that most royal children became experts at living double lives. During the day, they were the picture of virtue, reciting poems, playing harp, and demonstrating the correct method for bowing to a cousin. At night, the more adventurous ones traded secrets, wrote forbidden stories in cipher, and convinced their tutors to explain things their parents never would. Scandal was always lurking. The smallest slip, a misplaced joke, a mysterious bouquet, an unexplained bruise from an unsanctioned midnight fencing match could prompt a week of moral lectures and the sudden arrival of a new, even sterner tutor. Meanwhile, the older children passed down forbidden knowledge in whispered conversations behind the drapery, ensuring that every new royal generation arrived slightly more prepared, or at least more cunning, than the last. Occasionally, a particularly precocious prince or princess would outwit their minders entirely, winning a temporary reprieve from virtue in favor of actual learning. A few went on to write scandalous novels under false names. Others simply grew up, nodded politely at the family portraits, and quietly vowed to let their own children have just a little more fun. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember, the strictest rules always inspire the cleverest rebellions, and sometimes the best teachers are the ones you're not supposed to know about at all. Now that the palace is dark, let's tiptoe into the royal bathroom, a chilly place where the answer to almost every physical, emotional, or moral dilemma was, have you tried a cold bath? In the Victorian age, comfort was suspicious, pleasure was perilous, and nothing said virtue like voluntarily dunking yourself in freezing water. Welcome to the royal tradition of cold baths and ice treatments. The most effective way to make sure you never, ever got too comfortable. The reasoning behind all this ice was simple, at least, by Victorian standards. Medical experts insisted that hot water was dangerous, enervating, and likely to awaken passions best left dormant. Cold water, on the other hand, was a tonic for the soul, a cure for every ailment, and the best-known method for discouraging excess desire. If you were feeling tired, anxious, rebellious, or in any way less than perfectly docile, the prescription was always the same. Plunge, shiver, repeat. The palace bathtubs themselves were feats of uncomfortable engineering. Enormous porcelain affairs filled each morning with buckets of icy well water. No matter your age or title, you were expected to brave the frigid depths at least once a week. More often, if you showed any signs of excitement, unruliness, or scandal of scandals, independent thought, royal children dreaded bath day with a passion usually reserved for Latin lessons and boiled cabbage. Even the Queen, famously stoic, once confessed that the anticipation of a cold bath is worse than its reality. High praise, considering she'd endured 9 pregnancies and most of Prince Albert's poetry. For the truly unfortunate, there were additional treatments. Ice packs for the temples, to quiet the mind, snow rubbed on the wrists, to cleanse the blood, and, in cases of particular nervousness, a brisk walk in a frosty garden, preferably before dawn and definitely without a coat. Physicians claimed this invigorated the nerves, but most palace insiders agreed it mostly just kept everyone too busy shivering to think about anything inappropriate. Ice treatments weren't limited to the physical, either. Emotional distress? A cold compress, of course. Unwanted romantic thoughts? Cold bath, followed by cold soup for dinner, and, if necessary, a stern lecture on the virtues of discomfort. Rumor had it that more than one royal engagement was called off after an especially bracing ice regimen, which did wonders for family discipline and nothing at all for morale. Of course, not everyone suffered equally. Senior royals occasionally negotiated for lukewarm water, doctor's orders, they'd say, through chattering teeth, while visiting dignitaries were treated to special hot baths, discreetly filled just for them. The staff, meanwhile, became experts in boiling water in secret, sneaking in pitchers when they thought nobody was looking, ensuring that at least some members of the royal family learned to associate the smell of warm steam with both relief and minor acts of rebellion. All these cold water rituals, of course, were always for your own good. But the truth was, they mostly just reminded everyone that life in the palace was designed to keep you alert, disciplined, and slightly on edge at all times. The only thing colder than the bathwater was the disappointment on the Queen's face if you ever asked for extra blankets. Tonight, as you snuggle into your warm bed, take a moment to be grateful for modern comforts. Hot showers, soft pajamas, and the absence of anyone demanding you ice your wrists for moral hygiene. Sleep deeply, knowing you'll never be awakened for a pre-dawn ice bath for your own good, and that, no matter what, comfort is always allowed in your kingdom. So tonight, as you settle into your clean sheets, maybe with only 1 or 2 decorative pillows instead of 40, take a quiet moment to appreciate just how far we've come. You've made it through the gauntlet of royal bedrooms, survived the lace, the leeches, the suspicious gadgets, and a few too many cousins marrying cousins. You didn't have to fake enthusiasm for a cold bath, invent an excuse for the modesty curtain, or explain to a chambermaid why you need an instruction manual for your own wedding night. If history teaches us anything, it's that people have always been just a little bit ridiculous, no matter how many jewels they wear or how many rules they try to enforce. The royals of Victorian England lived in a world overflowing with ceremony, secrecy, and enough anxiety about ankles to power a small city. They layered themselves in clothing, etiquette, and awkward silences, hoping nobody would notice the mess under all that velvet. And yet, behind every curtain, every diary, and every trembling candlestick was just another human being, hoping to get through the night without a scandal, an embarrassing rash, or another awkward family portrait. So as you drift off, maybe be grateful that your biggest bedtime problem tonight is choosing between Netflix and sleep, not remembering which cousin you're allowed to marry or where the bishop is hiding. If you have indoor plumbing, a thermostat, and zero risk of waking up to a room full of historians analyzing your pajamas, consider that a win. Whisper a thank you to your ancestors, who braved the worst of Victorian nonsense so you could someday enjoy pajamas that make sense. Because history may be horrifying, hilarious, and occasionally horny, but it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and always just one questionable fashion trend away from immortality. Sleep well, and may your dreams be scandal-free and entirely free of goat testicles. Good night.